Hey, let's talk about mitochondrial DNA. I'm really excited because I think most of the time people kind of dismiss mitochondrial DNA as being helpful genealogical research. And there are a lot of ways that you can use your mitochondrial match list at Family Tree DNA to make some progress in your research. So let's look at what is DNA. So we know that we have two different kinds of DNA, and we've talked about this many times, but one is nuclear DNA. That's what our autosomal DNA and our X and our Y DNA is. Mitochondrial DNA is a completely different kind of DNA in the cell, and it's in the mitochondria, the energy producer of the cell. And so it's a different kind of DNA. It has a different kind of inheritance pattern, and we have match lists if you do a mitochondrial DNA test at Family Tree DNA. So where is DNA? Well, it's in all of our cells, in the nucleus. And what we know about autosomal and X and Y DNA is that it's in every cell, except sometimes, like red blood cells lose their nucleus to make room for oxygen. Sometimes cells are used for skin or hair or nails, and those become cornified. So the nucleus is destroyed in order to make room for keratin. But for mitochondrial DNA, it's a specialized part of the cell that generates the energy that the cell needs. So mitochondrial DNA is a ring. It's still a double helix, but it's a ring shape. And there are about 15 to 17,000 base pairs in a full mitochondrial DNA test. So when you go to Family Tree DNA and decide to take a mitochondrial DNA test, one thing that you'll find is that they offer two kinds. They offer a lower price and a higher price. And the higher price is the full sequence. That's the one you want. That's the one that has match lists that are going to be useful. But if you buy the lower cost one, what they're testing is what's called the control region. So that's that light blue region right at the very top of the diagram on the right. That control region isn't going to give you a really helpful match list. So how do we get our DNA? Well, through sexual reproduction, the egg contains mitochondrial DNA. The sperm doesn't. Well, the sperm has a little bit for the sperm to get the job done of fertilizing the egg, but the mitochondrial DNA is not passed on from the father. So at birth, most research has shown that women have all the eggs that they will ever have. There are a few ongoing studies that challenge this, but in general, through the past decades, scientists have believed that women have all the eggs they're ever going to have. And if you look at the size of the egg compared to the size of the sperm, a good amount of that has to do with the fact that the egg has the mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondria has haplogroups, just like Y-DNA, or very similar to Y-DNA has haplogroups. Mitochondria has different haplogroups, different names, different branching, but same concept that this comes about through mutation over time and migration patterns. And so if you notice that L1 on the far left, that's the oldest haplogroup. We call that mitochondrial Eve. And all the way on the far right is K, and that's the most recently developed haplogroup due to mutation. And so that is more like what we are considering to be modern day UK. And it is just a coincidence that those last two are U and K. So when you think about UK, you should probably think about T, U, and K all being from that region of the world. And so mitochondrial haplogroups develop because of mutations over time. And as people migrate and time passes and there are mutations, then new haplogroups form. And it's very similar to what we see in Y-DNA. This is from 23andMe. They have a participant chart that shows the frequency among their database. Now, 23andMe does give you a high-level haplogroup for your mitochondrial DNA and a high-level haplogroup for your Y DNA if you're male. And so what we see here are what 23andMe calls that maternal line, which is mitochondrial DNA, haplogroup frequencies. So in the database, in the predominantly American database, almost 40% are H, and then we have U, J, K, T, and work our way to some of the smaller ones. And so when you think about what our American database looks like, it is predominantly European based. And so in terms of ethnicity and ancestry and that sort of thing. So I have a haplogroup of T1A3A. So if you look for the T's, about 8% of the people in the 23andMe database have that. And my husband, Christopher, is a K2A, and he's at about 8% of the database. My mitochondrial DNA is predominantly German, and my husband's mitochondrial DNA is predominantly UK, Ireland. So if you want to find out more about haplogroups, there are several places you can go to learn more about mitochondrial haplogroups. Upedia is one, and there's a link here that you can follow and a link in your handout. And if you search for mine, the T1A3, you can find some general information about that branching. It's found in England, Scandinavia, Germany, Lithuania, Algeria, Greece, and India. And specifically, mine is Germany, Norway. And again, great generalizations, but it's a direction, right? And what do we know about our mitochondrial DNA? Well, we're inheriting that from mother and from grandmother and from great-grandmother in that one line of our family. And so when we think about, there's a lot of unknown women there, right? We know maybe first names, we don't know last names. And so it's really important to take every clue we can to try to figure out how to bust down some of those unknown brick walls. You can see here for my husband's, the K2As, there's a lot of different notes here about where those are found, the K2As. His mother is part Irish, mother's mother's mother. So just to give you an idea there. So there are mitochondrial DNA testing companies, but only one offers you the match list. So Family Tree DNA has autosomal mitochondrial and Y DNA testing. 23andMe, as I mentioned before, has high-level mitochondrial testing. So you can find out that haplogroup or a high-level haplogroup from them. Living DNA also has autosomal DNA and a mitochondrial test that's almost as precise as the full sequence family tree DNA. And of course, living DNA is a lot less expensive than the full sequence at family tree DNA. But just keep in mind, living DNA does not have match lists for mitochondrial testing yet. So which type of test do you need? Well, as I mentioned before, you want to do full sequence if you go to family tree DNA. That's where you get mitochondrial matches that are genealogically significant. That's an important part of why we might do this test. It's an interesting endeavor to find out regions or migration patterns, but what we really want are matches that might help us break down some brick walls. Family tree DNA has a partial sequence mitochondrial test, but the matches aren't going to be very helpful. They're basically broken down into a couple of different groups based on regions. And that's regions of Y DNA, not regions of the world. Living DNA does give you that high haplogroup. And for me, if you look at the difference, what they gave me at Living DNA was T1A3, and the full sequence at Family Tree DNA gave me T1A3A. For Christopher, same. His his high-level haplogroup and his haplogroup at Family Tree DNA were the same. For me, at 23andMe, again, I got kind of that higher level haplogroup. No mitochondrial matching. So you can find out what mitochondrial group you're in, but that doesn't necessarily help you genealogically unless you have those match lists. So what does the test tell you? Well, remember, we have 3 different kinds of DNA testing. We have the Y-DNA test that tests our surname line, that father's 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 line. And because I'm female, I do not have Y-DNA, but my father does, my brother, my uncles. So that line is Y-DNA testing. The line along the bottom edge is mitochondrial testing. So from me to my mom's mom, that line on the very bottom is mitochondrial testing. So sometimes people misinterpret. 23andMe calls it a maternal line test, and that confuses people. Sometimes they think that's all the women in their tree, but it's really the matrilineal line. It's really that one specific mother line. The inheritance pattern is from mother to child. Mother to son does happen, of course, because men have mitochondrial DNA, but men just don't pass it on to their children. And then, of course, we know autosomal DNA is all the DNA that we receive from all of the ancestors that we have, including that surname line and the mitochondrial line, including all of those ancestors. So we're going to focus predominantly on mitochondrial DNA tonight, but we are going to pull in some autosomal DNA when we're talking about how to utilize our match lists. So mitochondrial testing. Everyone has mitochondrial DNA from their mother, men and women. It tests the mother's DNA from grandmother to daughter, or from grandmother to mother to son. And it remains relatively unchanged for tens of thousands of years. It has a very slow mutation rate, and it has about 16,000 base pairs. Remember, when you're talking about how many base pairs we test in autosomal DNA testing, it's around 700,000. So it's very, very small in comparison to what we're doing with our other chromosomes. So you can see on my family line, at the top in the left is me, and you can see all the people that I've highlighted in red who share mitochondrial DNA with me. Same exact mitochondrial DNA. There may or may not be 1 or 2 mutations along the way, but my children, my mother, April, my grandmother, Ada, my great-grandmother, Cora, and back on in the generations, my second great-grandmother, Anne, my third great-grandmother, Deborah, my fourth great-grandmother, Mary, and my fifth great-grandmother, Sarah. So when you think about all of the different people who share mitochondrial DNA with me, including my siblings who aren't listed here, my siblings, my brother and sister also. And then when you think about, does my grandmother, Ada, have any daughters who also have descendants? Does my grandmother Ada have any sisters who also have descendants? Does my great-grandmother Cora have any other daughters besides my grandmother who have descendants? Does Cora have any sisters who have descendants? So you can see that that network can get pretty big pretty soon. Now, does everybody mitochondrial test? No. But it's interesting to think about, we've got ancestry matches, autosomal matches to a lot of these ancestors. So we're going to incorporate both of those. If you look at my husband, Christopher, what you'll see is that his children have their mother's mitochondrial DNA. So they're not part of the mitochondrial plan with him. So if you look at his mother, Catherine, his grandmother Elizabeth, great-grandmother Clara, second great Elizabeth, those are his mitochondrial DNA family. And again, if his mother had a daughter who had children, if his grandmother had a daughter or a sister who had children, and so on, you would start to see that same pattern where there could be quite a few who've mitochondrial tested. Now, I will mention here that results will vary because if you think about what we know about my family, a couple of 100 years in the United States. If you think about what you know after all these months or years of hearing about my husband's family, recent German and Irish immigrants. And so he doesn't have as many matches in the database as I do. I have pages and pages and pages of matches. So it's just something to consider. The size of your match list, the number of your exact matches is going to vary a lot depending on your family structure and whether or not people have tested. So remember, it's that mitochondrial line in your family, that mother, 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 mother line, that bottom line of your tree. That's who gives you your mitochondrial DNA. So you can filter by mitochondrial contributors at DNA Painter. So when you upload a tree to DNA Painter, you have the option of filtering for autosomal DNA, Y-DNA, X-DNA, and mitochondrial. And so this is what it looks like, all the ancestors in the mitochondrial inheritance pathway. So if you just hover over, if this were live, you'd be able to see it. But if you hover over any of those that are kind of green polka dot, you will see my mom, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and so on. And you'll see all those women on that lower part of the chart in the fan chart. Who else has the same mitochondrial DNA as I do? Well, my children do. My mom and my mom's sister's children, my grandmother Ada and her sister's children, my great-grandmother Cora, she didn't have any sisters, my sister's children, me and my siblings, my mom's siblings, and of course any of their children. So you can quickly think of who's in your network. Maybe it helps you to make a picture or like a pictograph or something to show you who all the people are who potentially gave you the same mitochondrial DNA that they have. So who has the mitochondrial DNA to break your brick wall? You can make an ancestor chart. You want to make sure that you do descendants too. You can do that photo array. You can print your tree and highlight. You can use those fan charts that are in DNA Painter. There are a lot of ways that you can determine who has mitochondrial DNA to break your brick wall. And I've also given you a handout of the chart that I use as well. So this is what it looks like, the one that's filled in. What I sent you in email was this one that's filled in, but I also sent you a blank one that you can use. So it starts in the lower left with me, Kelly. And so if you go across, how many female siblings do I have? My sister. And then how many male siblings do I have? My brother. So if I wanted to mitochondrial DNA test my brother, I could. He and I would have the exact same mitochondrial DNA from our mother. There might be a mutation, but generally there's not. It takes a long time for those mutations. It could happen in any generation. If you go from me to my mother, and you look at her female siblings and any children they had, her male sibling, and he doesn't pass that on. So what you end up doing is you go to grandmother, great-grandmother, and you look at sisters, and you look at siblings, and you look at the brothers, and you think about who is it that's in your mitochondrial network of people. It's everyone in gray. And the men on the far right, the male siblings at each generation, have the mitochondrial DNA, they just don't pass it on. So if any of them are still living, they could contribute to your mitochondrial group, but they're not passing that on to their children. So keep in mind some general things. You might find surprises. Surprises might find you. Sometimes there are weird results with DNA. We all know this, and Blaine Bettinger always talks about how we have two trees. We have a genetic tree and a genealogical tree. And don't forget that undocumented genealogy is mythology. we need to document. And documented genealogy without DNA support is also potentially mythology. So what we think we know about the mitochondrial or matrilineal line in our tree, it could actually be wrong. And so mitochondrial DNA might help us suss that out as well. So what do your matches look like? So let's look at family tree DNA so you can see what a mitochondrial match list looks like. So this is my husband's mitochondrial match list at family tree DNA. So what you'll notice here is that it has, he has 201 matches, and he has one match that's a 0 genetic distance. So let's review what that 0 genetic distance is. That means there's no mutations between my husband and this particular match. That means that there haven't been any mutations for whatever period of time and whatever genetic distance there is and whatever genealogical distance there is between him and this match. So that's a promising lead, but there's only one person. And remember what I said about his family, very recent immigrants, so you're probably not going to see as many people in the database. You want to search family trees, you want to look at these matches, you want to look at the genetic distance of one, even though it could be really long time ago where you have a common ancestor. But you want to definitely check them out. And look at family finder tests, search family trees, see if you see any common surnames or if anyone makes sense. Now, I will tell you that this JEMIMA Broyles, who was born in 1796, is in my husband's tree. So that one person who did the mitochondrial test does somewhat confirm that we're on the right trail with one of his ancestors. So what can we find out about JEMIMA Broyles? Well, we can look at the tree. And if you go to Ancestry and you look for JEMIMA Broyles, I found 483 trees where she's listed. So even though we use family tree DNA and the mitochondrial test there, we can still go to the other testing companies. We can check here, we can check MyHeritage, we can check other sites for JEMIMA Broyles and see if there are trees that have her listed and maybe get some clues from that. My husband has an 1890 German great-grandmother to the US. And so this is, if you look at this tree, this is one that I just kind of printed offline. And this other family has the early 1700s Germany to the US. So is there a connection? Possibly. There's a painter family. And if I look at one of my husband's ancestors, the Naumans, part of his family, he's got painters marrying Naumans in his family. So maybe there's some connection here between this Julia painter that's in this family. Maybe it's a close family group. So we're just gathering hints along the way. And we're using what we can find at Ancestry to help us with what we already have at Family Tree DNA. Now, if you look at my mitochondrial matches, what you'll see is a little bit different story, excuse me, than what my husband has, because look at all those zeros. I have hundreds and hundreds of matches, and I have several pages of 0 genetic distance. So if you look at my list, what do you see here? I see a Mary Elizabeth GEARHEART. Now remember, I had a Sarah GEARHEART in my matrilineal line. So that's interesting that someone is saying their earliest known ancestor is Mary Elizabeth GEARHEART. So let's see what we can find out about this Mary Elizabeth GEARHEART from this other person's list as their earliest known ancestor. So is this the same woman as my Sarah Elizabeth GEARHEART, or what I think is my Sarah Elizabeth GEARHEART, my 5th great-grandmother on that matrilineal line? So when I look at this, look at the birth years, 1771 for both. Mary Elizabeth has a death of 1850. Sarah Elizabeth has a death of 1847. So are these sisters? Are they twins? Is my tree wrong? Is their tree wrong? Who knows? It could be any of those. So I look for a couple other matches who have Sarah Elizabeth Gearhart in their tree or Mary Elizabeth Gearhart. In this case, at Family Tree DNA, they all are saying that Mary Elizabeth is their ancestor. Sandy and Victoria both show a genetic distance of 0. Both of them have Mary Elizabeth Gearhart listed as their furthest back ancestor that they know of. So I'm going to look for these two women in my family finder matches. I'm going to look at trees. I'm going to search their surnames. And then I'm going to go to through lines. Now, what do we know about through lines? For all of our ancestors up through 5th great grandparents, so for parents, greats, great-greats, all the way to 5th greats, we have through line tiles. If we think we know who is related to us and we have our DNA linked, and there's some other things you have to do for through lines. But if you haven't tried through lines yet, look for who is in your mitochondrial line. So I'm going to start with Mary Bozeman. And Mary Bozeman is, I think, the daughter of Sarah Gearhart. And what you also want to think about here in terms of your matches and through lines is noting male and female. Because remember, mitochondrial DNA is female to female to female to female to female in terms of the inheritance. So your autosomal DNA matches and through lines, you need to check those female to female to female lines to see if you have any corresponding people who might be in your mitochondrial DNA match list. So I'm going to start with Mary Bozeman. She's my 4th great grandmother in that matrilineal line, in that same mitochondrial line. And I'm going to see what I can find out for her. Now, I know you can't see this, but in pink is everyone that I've discovered using through lines who's related to me through lines to Sarah Elizabeth Gearhart. Now, I think I have a little bit bigger picture of this. Yes, let's blow that up. So this is Sarah Elizabeth Gearhart in that top row, Mary Bozeman in the next row, and you can see Elizabeth Betsy Bowman, a sister, and descendants. You can see here also Sarah Barger, Madison Barger, John Barger, who are all siblings. And then you see Peter Dagger by himself over there. So you can kind of get an idea of family structure, and you get all the way to the bottom, and those are DNA matches to me. Now, those are autosomal DNA matches to me, a bunch of 5th cousins. Now, what do we know about mitochondrial DNA? It has to be female to female to female to female to female. So what we want to do with that whole big long chart is go column by column and see if we see any mom, 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 all the way down the line. So if you look at the first column, near the bottom is Joseph. So Joseph's the end of the mitochondrial DNA line. Now, Joseph may have autosomally DNA tested, but I don't think so. He's not showing up in through lines. Look at the next column. There's Harry and a Howard. So nope, Sarah is not a mitochondrial DNA match there. Sarah G at the bottom. Let's look at Bridget at the bottom. Well, she's got Donald, Dale, Samuel, so no. If we look at Lou, C at the bottom in pink, we've got a William, a Joseph, a John. So no, not a mitochondrial match. So these are autosomal matches to this same ancestor, Sarah Gearhart, but they're not mitochondrial matches. So let's look at Donna. So what do we know about Donna? Well, there's a George in there, a John, and a Peter, so no. And Ruth has an Earl and a Peter, no. And David has a Peter, so no. So if you think about all the people I had in that list and you go column by column by column, you want to look to see if any of your autosomal matches might actually be mitochondrial matches in the other testing company. So they probably have a similar username, or you can find out ages or look at trees and kind of piece together whether or not they're your mitochondrial matches. But even if they aren't your mitochondrial matches, so none of these 7 are my mitochondrial match. But look at all the people that I've added to my tree, as long as I prove that through lines is right. And look at all the different generations I've found, all the sets of siblings I've found, all the types of cousins I've found, just by doing this with that one tile at through lines. So how do I use mitochondrial DNA matches? So there are a couple things that you can do. You can join a mitochondrial haplogroup study. That is one option. There are lots of different types of mitochondrial haplogroup studies. Obviously, they're not the same as the Y-DNA. The Y-DNA, you can have surname studies. So there aren't surnames for mitochondrial, but you can join a study. You can work on your tree, your maternal line, your matrilineal line, using the surnames of your full matches for clues. So you're looking at your matches in mitochondrial DNA, so your family tree DNA match list, but you're also looking at all the wealth of information and matches you have to those through line tiles that are in your matrilineal line. You definitely want to look at locations of known matches. This is something that will help you in your figuring out where they came from, jump the pond, all that kind of thing. Look at locations. People overlook that a lot, but they can be really important. And if someone has the exact same mitochondrial DNA as your full sequence, they are in your mother and mother's mother and mother's mother's mother line, your matrilineal line. So you want to try to figure out who all those folks are. The problem is we don't know generationally how close they are to us. We just don't know. Unless we get lucky and we see a surname maybe that we recognize, or we're able to tie them into our third or fourth or fifth great grandmother. But remember, mitochondrial DNA is very stable over time. And so what you might end up with are a lot of more distant matches. You can join a project. So there are all kinds of ways that you can join projects by regions and things like that. And you can join the project by haplogroup. So when I looked for my group, it doesn't have a specific mitochondrial DNA project. I could start one, in my free time. But don't forget to Google your haplogroup, because that's another thing where you might find a lot more information. Sometimes you'll find things that have been written about this group. Sometimes you'll find things that are historic or about the migration pattern or famous people with that haplogroup. So don't forget to Google it. You can communicate with matches. So this is one of the things that I do when I communicate with matches. I will build a chart for the different branches and have them ready to copy or attach to an email or send to someone. And in this case, with mitochondrial DNA, I'm looking predominantly at that matrilineal line, but oftentimes I'll include more. You can save a GEDCOM to share, and most software and Ancestry and Roots Magic, you have the ability to download a GEDCOM. You can keep living people private, no problem with that. Mention other relatives who've been tested so that they can start to draw connections. So if you and your sisters and brothers have all tested, let them know that there's kind of a family group already there. And if you're looking for bio parents, keep in mind some communication might be shocking to someone, so be sensitive. And maybe you're looking for bio parents and maybe they are. So just consider that as you're reaching out to matches. There is some boilerplate language that I use for emailing matches, And so I've included this here. You and I are 0 genetic distance according to our mitochondrial DNA testing. That means we have a common maternal ancestor. Here are my mom's and my grandmother's and my great grandmother's names to the best of my knowledge. And so I just copy and paste this into a message if I'm going to message people at Ancestry, or for mitochondrial DNA in particular at Family Tree DNA. So do you have any of these names in your family? So that's the kind of thing that I copy and paste. So what about mitochondrial DNA and ethnicity? Living DNA, I think, has one of the best displays for mitochondrial DNA and ethnicity kind of combinations. So if you want to find out where your mother line descends, you can do that test at Living DNA. You can get that higher level haplogroup, and it's a pretty high level haplogroup, almost as good as family tree DNA. And then you can click on genetic overview or coverage map or migration map or phylogenetic tree. And so this is the migration map that shows kind of where mitochondrial DNA started with mitochondrial Eve in Africa, and how the different branches branched out into the world. So this one is mine for T1A3. And so what you can see is, starting with that root person in Africa, that pink, there are branches within Africa, and then kind of heading north, there's an N group and an R group, and eventually you get a T group up there, pretty close to Germany. The phylogenetic tree is the branching. And so this is very difficult to read, and there was no way I could upsize it any more than this, unfortunately. But if you have a test at Living DNA, you can look at your phylogenetic tree and where are the branches, and where's the branch for your haplogroup, and then where are you further down in that sequence. This is for my husband for his K2A group. And so you can see that starting with that root person in Africa and migration. His K group is over there in, what is that, Italy, it looks like. And of course, there's lots of different other branches that end up coming off of there. But this is just kind of a high level migration route. And his phylogenetic tree. You can see up at the top is the root on the top right, and then working your way towards him down in the lower left. And that just shows all the branching of the different haplogroups. At 23andMe, you can find your maternal haplogroup in your summary of your DNA results. And it says here that my haplogroup is T1A3. And as our ancestors ventured out of Eastern Africa, they branched off into diverse groups, and they span the globe. So you can see that there's some general information there about haplogroups. Again, no match list. You can see the migration pattern at 23andMe, and you can look at all the different kind of spans of time. So the L group, the African beginning groups, are almost 200,000 years ago, and working their way up to group T first appeared about 25,000 years ago. So that's a really long time ago. But it's interesting to think about migration and how people moved around the world, and then how their DNA changed over time and mutated over time. So what are the next steps that you want to do with your mitochondrial DNA? So you want to add your DNA matches to a spreadsheet or download your aggregate data. So you want to download that list of mitochondrial matches, and you can do that at Family Tree DNA. For each full sequence match that's a genetic distance of 0, email them. Now, those of you who've heard me talk before about contacting matches, for autosomal DNA, I don't contact anybody ever, really. I just don't email people. But for mitochondrial, I do, predominantly because could be so long ago that you related to them. 500 years, you know? And so most people aren't really threatened by someone emailing and asking them about mitochondrial DNA in a way that they might be threatened in autosomal DNA. So if two or more matches have the same earliest known ancestor, consider emailing them as a group. So one kind of general rule of thumb for emailing on any of these sites is you don't want to mass email. You don't want to add everybody in your match list to one big email. But what I have done is if I notice two people have the same Mary Elizabeth Gearhart, I might email both of them together. But don't do a bunch of emails. Don't do a bunch of spam kind of things. And check your family tree DNA autosomal results, so that's Family Finder, for those same people to gain some context in where is it that they are a link to you mitochondrial potentially, or where do their Gearharts fit in with your Gearharts, or where do their Bosemans fit in with yours, and that sort of thing. So your mitochondrial matches could also be autosomal matches if they've tested. If there's a close enough connection in time, they might show up on your autosomal DNA list. They might be way down in the weeds because you saw on mine, when I went back to Mary Elizabeth or Sarah Gearhart, still don't know if they're the same person or twins or what, but when I went all the way down from my matches from Sarah, I'm in the land of fifth cousins. So I'm in the land of pretty small segments at that point. You want to check GEDmatch if you're on GEDmatch for your matches, for their autosomal information. So again, take what you gleaned from your mitochondrial list and go to GEDmatch if you're already there. Check MyHeritage DNA, Ancestry DNA, Living DNA. You want to check all the companies for your matches. And then finally, you want to figure out how to get organized, whatever works for you. So you saw that I had that spreadsheet of all of my mitochondrial matches. Well, I didn't show you that spreadsheet, my download of matches. But I also have a spreadsheet where I started through lines to that particular female that I know has passed on mitochondrial DNA and should be, if everyone in that lineage DNA tested, 1,000 maybe matches if everyone would test. So it's a lot of different ancestors who come through that line. So I'm going to aggregate all of that from through lines and put it into a big spreadsheet. Depending on the number of matches you have, you might build a timeline of their earliest known ancestors. You want to do this according to genetic distance. So you want to take your 0 genetic distance matches and see if you can pinpoint some of those earliest known ancestors by within 50 years or so. So where is that Mary Elizabeth or that Sarah Gearhart? I think they were born in what, 1771, I think. So you're going to put that right about 1771. And how many people have earliest known ancestors in that range? And just kind of map them. And maybe you can start to see a pattern where surnames are changing. And maybe you can trace that, or you can find descendants today who link back to someone further back. And then do that again for those who have a genetic distance of 1. And look for patterns to see if you can figure out maybe a pattern in surnames. So there are a couple ways you can learn more. ISOGG, I always recommend ISOGG, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, has a wonderful website for pretty much everything. And so you can go here and you can look up mitochondrial DNA and you can find out all sorts of things about inheritance patterns and that sort of thing at their site. So let's look at the websites. And this is the point where I'm not going to be recording any further. So thanks for joining us today if you're watching on YouTube.